In this PowerPoint, I'll be going through the structure and function of the plasma membrane. This is part of Area Study 1 for Unit 1 Biology for crossing the plasma membrane. So today we're focusing on the characteristics of the plasma membrane as a semi-permeable boundary between the internal and external environments of a cell. So first let's look at the function of the plasma membrane. So remember that cells exist in a watery environment of the extracellular fluid. So on the outside of the cell you have the extracellular fluid, and then on the inside of the cell you have what's called the intracellular fluid, and they will be consisting of different concentrations and different components. So the plasma membrane acts as a boundary between these two environments and also controls the movement of substances between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. We also know this intracellular fluid as the cytosol. The cytosol makes up the cytoplasm. So we call the plasma membrane a term known as semi-permeable. So semi-permeable means that it only allows certain substances to cross, whether that's in or out of the cell. Now there's different types of transport, which we'll go through at a different time. But diffusion is one of those main types. So remembering that diffusion is the movement of a substance from a high concentration to an area of low concentration. And this will vary depending on what type of molecule it is. The role of this plasma membrane also is in cell recognition. So for the body and cells to recognize other cells and to be able to communicate with other cells. So this might be the action of a hormone, for example. So why is the plasma membrane important? So remembering that the plasma membrane separates the internal environment from the external environment, it allows multicellular organisms to be able to regulate the conditions of their internal environment, which is crucial for them to be able to survive. It also allows cells to provide the specific environment needed by specialized cells and tissues, and for cells to function more efficiently. There's common regulated aspects of the internal environment, and these might be temperature, oxygen concentration, carbon dioxide concentration, pH, the osmotic pressure, so the balance of salts and ions, nitrogen wastes, and also glucose concentration. So all of these factors need to be regulated in order for those cellular processes to occur and take place efficiently. So first we go through the composition of the plasma membrane. So the composition is just what makes up the plasma membrane. The current model used to describe the structure of the plasma membrane is the fluid mosaic model. So it's been given this name because it has quite a fluid nature, and what that means is it's quite flexible. Mosaic, and this relates to kind of the understanding of that kind of artwork where there's lots of different components that are put together to create the larger image or structure. So here we can see there's a lot of different components that make up the plasma membrane, and we're going to go through the four main components in detail. So phospholipid molecules, cholesterol, proteins, and carbohydrates. So first we can see phospholipids is kind of structure there that I've identified. We have cholesterol, which are these structures here, these little yellow structures. We have proteins, so we have different style of proteins, but you can really see those structures in different points, that pink one. And then we have carbohydrates, which we can see identified there. So firstly, what are phospholipids? So the plasma membrane is described as a phospholipid bilayer. And what that means is it's made up of two layers of phospholipids. So if we look at the diagram, we can see that it's been magnified. So we've got the bilayer here. And if we look at it, we can see this is one phospholipid molecule and this is the other phospholipid molecule. So notice how they're facing inwards towards each other. And that forms two layers. Okay, that's what gives us the bilayer term. So phospholipids are molecules which are made up of a hydrophobic tail, which we can see here. We've actually got two hydrophobic tails, then the yellow, and then a hydrophilic head, which is kind of this blue structure here. Now hydrophobic, if we look at that term independently, hydro is a term that refers to water, and phobic is a term that refers to kind of against or repelling. Hydrophilic If we think of hydro, again referring to water, and philic or philia refers to kind of the affection for or loving or attracted to type thing. So those terms describe the chemical nature of each of those components. So the hydrophilic head repels water, and the hydrophobic tail will actually be attracted to water. And so that's kind of the nature of the phospholipid bilayer. So the hydrophilic heads, they face outwards towards kind of the extracellular or the intracellular environment, depending on which side of the cell we're referring to. And those hydrophobic tails are facing inwards. So you can see that they're kind of navigating in a way where they're repelling water. So really important that we understand the structure of each of those phospholipid molecules and how they make up, independently, they make up the whole surface of the cell and also the very interior surface of the cell as well. So phospholipids are impermeable to water-soluble particles, ions, and polar molecules. So let's look at some of those terms independently. So the term impermeable means that it doesn't allow things to go through. So water-soluble means anything that dissolves in water. Ions are referring to any charged particles, such as like a chloride ion, which is a negative ion, or a sodium positive ion. So they're charged particles. And polar molecules is the way molecules that have a bit of a charge in the way that they're arranged. So these molecules cannot cross freely across the plasma membrane because they are repelled or aren't allowed due to their structure to cross through by these phospholipids. So the only way that they can cross is through these protein channels. And like the way it sounds, a protein channel kind of forms a bit of a gate across the membrane to allow things to go into the cell or perhaps to go out of the cell. So plasma membranes are fluid structures. So like I said, they're quite flexible. So these phospholipid molecules can move about, so they can swap position and move around quite freely within that bilayer. Now, a really good video and a short video that just kind of describes this fluid nature of the membrane is just this link below. So I recommend just watching this quickly to have a better understanding of it. Next, we have cholesterol. Now, if we look on the diagram on the right, we can see cholesterol has been identified here. So it's this yellow structure, and you can see that they're spread out, and they might be located in the top bilayer, part of the bilayer, or the bottom part of the bilayer. And what the cholesterol does, it makes the membrane more stable, so less likely to, lose its structure. It also reduces the permeability of the membrane, and what this means, it makes it more controlling for which specific water-soluble molecules are able to cross, and it's quite an advantage to the membrane. Next, we have proteins. Now, there are three types of proteins that may exist within the plasma membrane structure. So we've got integral proteins. Now, these proteins are a permanent part of the membrane. So again, if we look at our diagram on the right, we can see that this protein here is an integral protein. And what that means is that it's permanently present. So it doesn't attach and reattach. It's always there as part of the membrane structure. If this integral protein crosses both of the phospholipid layers, so it goes from one side of the bilayer to the other, then we call it a transmembrane protein. If we're looking at any of these proteins that are attached to them, such as this one here, okay, so it's attached to an integral protein, but it only attaches temporarily. Okay, so this is called a peripheral protein. Now, these proteins have a variety of really important functions. So it might be transporting across a membrane. So like I said before, channel proteins. They might be involved in cell-to-cell recognition. So for one cell to be able to recognize another cell within the body. And also intercellular joining. So this term intercellular means between cells. So one cell might attach to another cell, perhaps to exchange some materials, or also in some sort of maybe bodily response. Okay, lastly we have carbohydrates. Now carbohydrates are usually linked to proteins or to lipids on the outer surface of the membrane. If they're attached to proteins, they're known as glycoproteins. If they're attached to lipids, they're known as glycolipids. Now they play an important role in the recognition and adhesion between cells and in the recognition of antibodies, hormones, and viruses by cells. So firstly, the recognition and adhesion between cells. What this is referring to is that cells need to be able to recognize other cells within the body in order to be able to communicate. The other one, adhesion, is the attachment of one cell to another. So sometimes in the exchange of materials or in communication, one cell may need to be attached to another cell. Then we have the recognition of antibodies. So in an immune response, your body will produce antibodies. And this is important in identifying and eliminating any foreign pathogens when they enter the body. Then we have hormones. So in an endocrine response, your endocrine glands will produce hormones. They'll travel throughout the body through the bloodstream, and then they'll act on other cells to carry out a response. So maybe, for example, to cause your heart rate to speed up. And that needs to be able to, act on the plasma membrane to cause that intracellular response. Lastly, we have viruses. So in order for your body to be able to recognize virus-infected cells within the body, it needs to have certain, communication structures, and these are located on the outside of the cell. And this is really important in not only the survival of a cell, but in the control and elimination of a particular, foreign pathogen within the body. So key ideas so far we have. So a major role of the plasma membrane of a cell is to act as a gatekeeper. So this controls the entry and exit of materials, both into the cell and out of the cell. So the major structural component of plasma membrane is a bilayer, so 2 layers, of phospholipid molecules. So each of these layers have hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails. And remembering that the hydrophilic heads, they kind of face towards the extracellular environment or the intracellular environment, and the hydrophobic tails face inwards because they were repelling this watery substance. The fatty acid chains within the plasma membrane have flexibility, so they enable the plasma membrane to be quite flexible. Proteins are an essential component of the plasma membrane. We may have integral proteins, which include transmembrane proteins, and we may also have peripheral proteins. The fluid mosaic model of membrane structure is currently accepted as the best description of the structure of the plasma membrane. So one of the key summary tasks I'd like you to do now is to create a poster of the structure and function of the plasma membrane. So you can use this image where you annotate the different parts of the membrane as well as the specific function of each of those parts. So a good way to assess your understanding of this topic is to go through some quick check questions. So firstly, what are the 2 major components of a plasma membrane? Identify whether each of the following statements is true or false. So A, the plasma membrane is present as a boundary in all living cells. B, the plasma membrane consists of layers of proteins in which phospholipids are embedded. C, a key role of the plasma membrane is the control of transport of materials into or out of cells. And D, transmembrane proteins span the width of the plasma membrane. Next question we have is, what is a glycoprotein? Next is, what part of a plasma membrane is responsible for its flexibility? And lastly, briefly outline the fluid mosaic model of the plasma membrane.